Hello, Archie Dunlop here with Talking Astrology with Archie. In this video, I'm going to be looking at the week starting on Monday, April the 8th, 2024. And this is a week that runs through until Sunday, April the 14th, 2024. As far as the structure of this video is concerned, I'm going to start off by looking at the astrology of the week, sort of taking a blow-by-blow account of the events as I see them. Then I'm going to look at a couple of people who may be impacted by the events. I haven't gone for very many people. I've gone for the German Chancellor, Olaf Scholz, and I've gone for the Secretary General of NATO, Jens Stoltenberg. So, having looked at the astrology for the week, I'm going to turn my attention to the I Ching, and I will do an I Ching reading for the week. And just remember, when you look at this I Ching reading, well, you don't in fact have to look at it. When you come to a section of this video relating to the I Ching, you can just not look at it, and then that forecast doesn't apply to you, because it's really important that any forecast, any casting of the coins or anything like that is a voluntary process, and it doesn't apply for you. It doesn't apply to you if you don't watch that section of this video. But let's start off with the astrology, and here we have the chart for the very beginning of the week, set for New York. Midnight, Monday, April the 8th, 2024. There's no particular reason why it has to be set for New York. It's just a matter of convenience. And at the beginning of the week, we can see there's a load of stuff in Aries. We've got Venus in Aries, Moon in Aries, Sun in Aries, North Node in Aries, Chiron in Aries, Mercury in Aries. So it's quite an Aries week, isn't it? A lot of action, people wanting to assert themselves. Also, we can't help noticing that there's a conjunction between Mars and Saturn, which is getting stronger at the beginning of the week and becomes exact, I think, on Wednesday. So the Aries emphasis matters, the Mars-Saturn conjunction matters. And right at the beginning of the week, on Monday, we have two events. The first event is a semisquare between Venus and Jupiter. There is Venus at 3 degrees 42 Aries. There's Jupiter at 1855 Taurus, so they're 45 degrees apart. And this Venus-Jupiter semisquare can be about indulgence. Remember, Venus and Jupiter are the benefics. Venus is the lesser benefic, Jupiter is the greater benefic. And when you put them together in a tense aspect, there can be overindulgence, taking things too far. That might be being over generous, having too much of a good thing, spending too much money on stuff. It could be about emotional indulgence, allowing one's feelings a free rein. Perhaps that's Venus in Aries, wanting to take the initiative, trying to be assertive, and semi-square Jupiter, doing it in a way that, I don't know, could be a bit embarrassing. You don't want to draw too much attention to yourself, and gushing displays of emotion, perhaps in an interpersonal way, should be avoided maybe at the beginning of the week. And also, I mentioned when I was talking about Venus moving into Aries that one problem with Venus in Aries is that it can have problems in terms of what looks good, aesthetics. Venus in Aries can have bad taste. Now, I'm not saying that if you have Venus in Aries, you've got bad taste. I'm saying that when Venus is moving through the sign of Aries, people can have bad taste. And with Venus semi-square Jupiter, we could see many displays of bad taste. And we don't want to be part of it. And this means we have to be really careful about buying things just because they look good. I mean, they may look good now, but they may not look so good tomorrow or next week. I would therefore be a bit cautious with that, with this semi-square between Venus and Jupiter. Also, on Monday, we have a new moon eclipse. There is going to be a moment in time when the sun is eclipsed, when the disk of the moon crosses that of the sun. And I think this is going to be visible roughly in the western United States on Monday at the precise time of this eclipse. And I know a lot of people are very excited about this eclipse. And it's certainly something we need to take note of, and I am going to look at it in detail. I've already looked at it in detail, but I'm going to look at it one more time. So after I've just gone through the week, I will go through it again in more detail. So eclipse on Monday, certainly a big deal. Then we move on to Wednesday the 10th. Now, you might think that this total eclipse of the sun is the most important event of the week. I don't think it necessarily is. I think the most important event this week is a conjunction between Mars and Saturn in Pisces. If Venus and Jupiter were the greater if Venus is the lesser benefic and Jupiter is the greater benefic, then Mars is the lesser malefic and Mars is the lesser malefic, Saturn is the greater malefic, and they're together. They're forming a conjunction in Pisces. So, having Mars conjunct Saturn in midweek, it's not nice. It's a bad aspect. There's no two ways about it. And Mars conjunct Saturn can cause all sorts of mischief, and we might feel frustrated, and if things can go wrong, they will go wrong, and in terms of what's going on in the world, there may just be a general feeling of negativity. And I think that this Mars-Saturn conjunction is made more intense by the fact that it's happening just after a new moon. It's almost locked into the new moon. And so I'm kind of thinking that maybe the Mars-Saturn conjunction and the new moon should not necessarily be seen as being separate events. The Mars-Saturn conjunction definitely colours this new moon eclipse on Monday. And I am of the view that this new moon is probably not particularly fortunate for a number of reasons, but I think a lot of it has to do with its connection between its connection to the Mars-Saturn conjunction. Then, right after that, on Thursday, I think that's Thursday the 11th, the Sun makes a conjunction to Mercury. Mercury is now starting to become really weak. I mean, all week long, Mercury is weakening. Remember, Mercury is retrograde. And it retrogrades back into the Sun. And so when you've got the Sun exactly conjunct Mercury, you could say that Mercury is completely burnt up on Thursday. There may be very little objectivity. People just can't see the wood for the trees, or it's just a question of being burnt. Just our rationality is just burnt out because the sun is too bright, and we can't make sense of what's going on around us. Though I should point out that there is a view that when the Sun is exactly conjunct Mercury, it's not unfortunate, it's actually fortunate. So it's like the Mercury gets steadily weaker as it moves towards the conjunction of Mercury. But when it's really close, and that might be on Thursday, there's a moment of clarity, because the Sun and Mercury are on the same wavelength. And so that might be something to look out for. So on Thursday, there might be a sense that things are getting worse, that we really don't understand what's going on, we're confused, it gets worse and worse, and then suddenly there's a moment where it all becomes clear, when Mercury is Kazimi, when it's so close to the Sun that it can't be damaged by the Sun, if that makes any sense. Then at the end of the week, I think that would be on Saturday, Mars makes a semi-square to Pluto. You can see this, there is Pluto. So when Mars gets to around 16 Pisces, it will be semi-square Pluto. So Mars semi-square Pluto is quite an assertive semi-square very often. Mars and Pluto is the principle of making one's force real. One's got these ideas, one's got this passion for something, and one wants to make it happen, and one wants to stamp one's authority on the world and use the power of our emotions. But there is a question of who is using Mars semi-square Pluto. It may be us. If you're a domineering person, Mars semi-square Pluto is going to encourage you to dominate your environment. If you're not such a dominating person, it may be other people trying to stamp their authority at the end of a week. So at the end of a week, if you're not the control freak, then someone else is the control freak. So ask yourself, who is trying to be in control? So looking at the week overall, there's some big stuff going on. I think it's a high pressure week, and I think there are lots of going on. I would expect there to be quite a lot going on in the news, and a lot of people may feel themselves to be under pressure. And I want to just look at two events in closer detail, and that is the new moon eclipse and the Mars-Saturn conjunction. So I've looked at the new moon eclipse before, but I don't think there's any harm in looking at it again. So I've set this eclipse for London out of convenience, and you can see in London you've got the south node on the ascendant, you've got the north node in the 7th house. So there's some issue perhaps if you're in England, and in terms of the UK government. The UK government might be concerned about its enemies. I suppose at the moment the UK's main enemy is Russia, and perhaps the new moon has something to do with that. And I'll be looking at the Secretary General of NATO's chart in a moment. But this new moon eclipse, as you can see, okay, it's conjunct Chiron. I've already mentioned that. I think from a personal point of view, if you take Chiron as being about healing, this may be a week where we can start a process by which we can help people. If you've got an opportunity to be a healer, to help the world around you, and to help the people around you, then this new moon might be the beginning of that process. And also, Chiron is the maverick. Charles Cowell, who discovered Chiron, remember it's a comet, he remarked, I believe, on how its orbit is incredibly elliptical. And so it is a maverick. In terms of its orbit, astronomically, it looks like a maverick. And it probably acts like a maverick as well. So maybe we can discover our inner maverick here with this new moon conjunct Chiron. It's probably not a time for any of us to be following the crowd. I mean, this new moon is conjunct the North Node. North Node is in Aries. New moon is in Aries. The way forward for all of us is to be individuals and to act as individuals, to think for ourselves. That is going to be hard to think for ourselves, to think for ourselves this week, because Mercury is in such a bad state, retrograde, moving to a conjunction of the Sun. It's so easy to be distracted. It's so easy to be gaslighted this week. But somehow we've got to make the effort. Somehow we've got to ignore what we're being told. Maybe it's right what we're being told, maybe it's wrong, but we certainly shouldn't accept facts at face value. I mean, we all know that governments and mainstream media, I mean, they're just full of lies and distortions. At least this week they are. So don't believe anything anyone tells you, and act in terms of how you feel and what you feel is right. But just don't make sure that you are not being distracted. So that's the new moon eclipse in Aries, and as has been pointed out to me, which I forgot to mention, so apologies for not mentioning it earlier last week when I was talking about this new moon eclipse, that this eclipse is ruled by Mars. And so to get a sense of what this eclipse is like, we should probably look at the planet Mars as well. And Mars, in a general sense, is quite an aggressive energy. It's about making things happen and standing up for ourselves. Yet, when we look at Mars, we see that Mars is conjunct Saturn at the time of the eclipse. And this is a reminder that this eclipse is completely coloured by the conjunction between Mars and Saturn. Mars and Saturn is an unfortunate energy. It's malefic, and it's really not going to help things. And it may be very difficult to make progress. And as I said, I think that this eclipse is going to probably bring things into the world that aren't very nice, and I have suggested that this new moon may be about bad actors, people taking the view that destruction is a good way of advancing their agenda. And that doesn't just mean terrorist organizations, it means governments, it means people out there, people in business, people in power. The means justify the end. Do whatever you like, provided you get your way. I'm not telling you to do that. I'm just telling you that that's the attitude of a lot of people out there. And there are bad actors who don't care how much damage they cause if it gives them some chance of getting their way. And I think we can see that in terms of this new moon. So when you look at what's going on in the world, particularly if it's destructive, ask yourself, cui bono, who benefits? Someone's benefiting. It might not just be an accident. And then on Wednesday, we have the conjunction between Mars and Saturn. This is the exact moment of the conjunction, 9:36 p.m. London time, I think, in Westminster, England. And there is the Mars-Saturn conjunction at 1441 Pisces. I don't know how useful it is to set up the exact chart of the Mars-Saturn conjunction. It's kind of interesting here with this Mars-Saturn conjunction that it takes place at the same time as a conjunction between the Moon, Jupiter and Uranus. So this is the situation on Wednesday. There's the exact Mars-Saturn conjunction, and there is Moon moving to a conjunction of Uranus. Now, you could say, well, that's nice. Moon is conjunct Jupiter. But how is that Moon-Jupiter conjunction working? I mean, I know that all things being equal, Moon-Jupiter conjunction is the best aspect in the book, really. But it also releases things. And so when the Moon is on a Jupiter-Uranus midpoint, it may be about release and not necessarily in a fortunate sense. And I'm very mindful that the fact that you've got Moon-Uranus conjunction at the same time as Mars-Saturn conjunction, and as a Mars-Saturn conjunction, and I think one has to be slightly concerned about that, surely, because you have the release of something really quite negative. It could be, very negative indeed. And so that's another reason for being cautious this week. This week could be very tense. Where? I don't know. I set up a astrocartography for the precise moment of this Mars-Saturn conjunction. And I don't read too much into this. Astrocartography, as I like to say, is a hit and miss technique. Can be very effective, but it can just mean absolutely nothing. But still, I'm going to set up the chart for this the Mars-Saturn conjunction. So what we're looking for is somewhere at the exact moment of the Mars-Saturn conjunction where the Mars-Saturn conjunction is itself very prominent. So here, for example, look at this red line. This are all the places where there is a Mars-Saturn conjunction, is on the IC. So it goes through Africa, goes through Algeria, and goes right through Europe. It might well go through Berlin. I'll look at the Mars-Saturn conjunction set for Berlin in a moment. So this might be an area where the Mars-Saturn conjunction is particularly effective. You can see that goes through the former Yugoslavia, up through Germany, and I think that's through Stockholm. So that is one possibility. Mars-Saturn is going to be on the descendant. Looks to me as if that's going through Washington. I want to look at the chart of a Mars-Saturn conjunction set for Washington, so I'll do that as well. So I want to look at Berlin, I want to look at Washington. Yeah, those are the two places I want to look at. So let's relocate this chart to Berlin. See what's there's Berlin. Okay, so if we relocate the chart for Berlin, there you can see that except for Berlin, Berlin has Saturn on the pretty close to the IC. Not exactly there, it's 4 degrees off, but there is a Mars-Saturn conjunction quite close to the IC, and also this Moon-Jupiter-Uranus conjunction is on the descendant. That might be Germany's enemies. So maybe we should be looking at what's going on in Germany with this Mars-Saturn conjunction, particularly in light of the full moon and how it impacts Olaf Scholz. Again, I will be looking at that in a moment. And we might also want to relocate the Mars-Saturn conjunction to Washington, D.C. I mean, Washington, D.C. is where it all happens, isn't it? Is the Western world run from Washington, D.C.? Okay, so at the precise moment of the Mars-Saturn conjunction, it's you can see that it's on the descendant. It's exactly on the descendant, and the descendant represents one's enemies. And so who are America's enemies? I suppose probably America's enemies are Russia and China. I mean, I suppose it could be random terrorists who have problems with America and want to attack America. But in terms of US foreign policy, I think this Mars-Saturn conjunction could be quite difficult. I just wanted to clarify when the Mars-Saturn conjunction was exact, because I might have not given you entirely accurate information there. So theoretically, it is exact. Okay, London time, it's exact 9:36 p.m. on Wednesday. European time in Berlin, that would be exact 10:36 on Wednesday. But I don't think with the Mars-Saturn conjunction you need to be too worried about its precise timing. I just think it could be quite difficult. Now, a couple of people who may be influenced by the Mars-Saturn conjunction. One of them is the German Chancellor, Olaf Scholz. So there's Olaf Scholz's horoscope. This new moon eclipse is at 1924 Aries. So it's on his descendant. Not exactly on his descendant, but it's within 2 degrees. And he is Chancellor of Germany. He's an important person, and perhaps with this new moon eclipse, his enemies will start coming out of the woodwork. He will be aware of who his opponents are, and this might be a beginning of a new cycle where he has to deal with his enemies. And those enemies might be domestic, his rivals, political rivals. It also might be international. I suppose, again, one has to be thinking about Germany's main enemy, which at the moment is Russia, and that's Olaf Scholz. Then there is the Secretary General of NATO. I would have said an important chart, the guy in charge of NATO, and he has his moon at 1435 Gemini, and he has Mars at 1632 Gemini. Moon Mars, a very aggressive combination there. I mean, supposedly in his youth he was he a socialist or progressive, whatever. That's what he claims he is, and now he's Secretary General of NATO, and he is extremely aggressive. He is a neocon. He wants to pursue this war with Russia to the maximum extent, and Moon Mars on the midheaven is about someone who is aggressive in public. Big statements about what NATO should be doing about Russia and how NATO should be supporting Ukraine. Yet, that Mars-Saturn is causing problems, isn't it? So let's just have a look. Let's actually look at his chart side by side with the Mars-Saturn conjunction. So if we put Jens Stoltenberg in the middle and we put the Mars-Saturn conjunction on the outer wheel, you can just see what's going on. So he has his descendant at 1312 Pisces. So right now, Jens Stoltenberg has Mars on his descendant. He's just had Saturn on his descendant. So that Mars-Saturn conjunction falls right on his descendant. And surprisingly, we do have an exact time of birth for Jens Stoltenberg. This isn't just a noon chart. So Jens Stoltenberg's enemies, it's becoming clear now. Okay, maybe political enemies, but I think this has something to do with Russia, I would have thought. And in his natal chart, he has got Moon conjunct Mars square his descendant. So Mars and Saturn are configuring that whole thing in his chart. So I don't know what kind of week Jens Stoltenberg is going to have, but it doesn't look too good, and I think he has to be careful. I mean, people like him are dangerous, aren't they? So we have to be careful how he responds to what's going on in Ukraine. As you know, we know that Ukraine is losing. Russia is pushing forward at increasing speed. It doesn't seem like it, but it's slowly happening, and he knows it's slowly happening, and so we're going to see how he responds. We're also going to see how Olaf Scholz responds. So that's the astrology, and what I want to do now is look at the I Ching. And when I do the I Ching, you have to remember that you don't have to listen to it. If you don't want to be involved in this I Ching reading, you don't want me to make any forecasts for you, then just don't listen. And it won't apply to you because, remember, I'm asking this question: what is the week going to be like for those watching the I Ching segment of this video? Only for those watching the segment. This question did not reference people watching this video in general, just those watching the I Ching segment. So if you don't want to watch it, you don't have to watch it. Okay, so let me now consider what I threw. So the coins I cast, the first hexagram I got was hexagram number 15, which is modesty. And remember, I'm going to be looking at this, at the I Ching, in 4 sections. This is a general section. Then I'm going to look at it from a perspective of money, then business and career, and finally relationships. So in a general sense, we've got modesty. This is telling us that we don't have to be someone who we're not this week. If we want to be successful, we want to have a good week, it's just so important to be ourselves, without any airs and graces. It's not a week for boasting, because if we've got abilities and skills and talents, they'll be self-evident. We don't have to shout about them. People know. It will be clear in our behavior who we are and what we can do. So absolutely no need for boasting. Now, there are 2 lines moving here. The second line moves and the top line moves. So the second line moving really does emphasize the point that we can be who we are. We absolutely don't have to. We don't have to boast. We don't have to try too hard. People will just accept us for what we are, and if we deserve something, then we will get it. Then the top line moves. The top line is a little bit confusing, because it's suggesting that there's something not quite right, and there is even a difference in interpretation. You know, I used 2 main sources for these I Ching readings. One is the Wilhelm translation of the I Ching, and the other is the translation of by Greg Winkup. And the Wilhelm translation is a little bit negative about this, about the top line, because it indicates that we may have to, we may almost have to go to war against ourselves. Now that sounds a strange thing, to go to war against ourselves, and what that means is we have to deal with our own ego. That there may be some aspect of ourselves which is not working well, and if we want to be effective, then we have to address it, and that might require a lot of introspection and self-honesty. And I suppose self-honesty is part of being modest, isn't it? Because if we're modest, we accept that we haven't got all the answers. And when we look at ourselves really closely, we really see that there is something wrong and we need to address the issue. So that's one way of looking at the top line. But there is another way of looking at the top line. And it's certainly talking about having to go to war, but not against ourselves, against perhaps someone who is superior to us, or we thought was superior to us. So it's almost saying we have to break out of our modesty and say, okay, modesty has reached a certain point where we have to confront authority, people who are perhaps up to no good, are not competent. We have to go to war against them. We have to perhaps even overthrow them. Because things have reached that stage, because our abilities are obvious. And because our abilities are obvious, we can get support. So maybe if you're in a confrontation and you felt that you're not strong enough, things can start happening. You are getting the support now. And the power of your own nature is beginning to make itself felt. And that gives the possibility of creating some changes and perhaps changing the power equation. Now, this hexagram modesty does transition because you've got two moving lines, and it moves to hexagram 18, which is illness. Wilhelm translation describes it as working on what has been spoilt. And I suppose this might feed into the concept that we're at war with ourselves, that something needs to be changed. Illness, what is it? Or it could be, I suppose it could be something external. But something is not right. But the I Ching gives a promise of it being curable. And it may not even be our fault. Something someone else has done wrong, but we need to fix the problem. And that is something that we now need to do with illness. And just don't get too upset by the word illness. It's almost certainly not about physical illness, but it is about something that needs to be cured. And there are things we can do to make things better. So that's the general picture of this I Ching reading. So let's now look at it from a perspective of money. So from a financial perspective, I think that's pretty obvious what this means, isn't it? This week, it is really important to be modest with your money. Spend as little money as possible, I would have said, without being extravagant in your lack of expenditure. I mean, you don't want to make a big show of not spending money. You need to spend what you have to spend. You don't want to draw attention to yourself through your financial behavior and spending too little money or being mean with your money. That's not modest. So you have to kind of go for the middle. But extravagance should not be tolerated. And that kind of links with what's going on astrologically, doesn't it? Because, I've said that this week we have Venus semi-square Jupiter, and there's a warning there, Venus semi-square Jupiter, particularly at the beginning of the week, that we could spend too much money on what it might well be expensive garbage. And so that is a possibility. Stuff that looks good, but it's just ugly and horrible. So modesty, we do have to be modest in our expenditure and just live within our means. But that doesn't mean to say that something can't be changed, because the top line of this hexagram is about being at war with ourselves. Now that sounds a bit unpleasant, but I didn't really mean it like that. It's about looking at our own expenditures, and however modest we are, there still seems to be something we're spending money on that we shouldn't be spending money on. There's some area that needs to be sorted out, and I think that becomes clearer when we realize that this hexagram moves to illness. In terms of your finances, you try hard to be modest, but even then you realize that something's wrong. There's some aspect of your financial situation that could really undermine you in a big way. Fortunately, illness has the promise of cure, and so you can take active measures to sort this problem out. And it may take a bit of time to actually realize what the problem is and perhaps who is responsible for it. It may not be your problem, but you may be being affected by this problem, but someone else's behavior, whether it's their overindulgence, whether it's their negligence, whatever it might be, someone else's behavior and someone else's past actions could be having a negative impact on your financial future, and now is the time to address the problem. And it does seem that you can be very effective about it. So that's money. So let's now move on to career and business. I think this speaks for itself. It's not a time for showing off. People don't want show-offs. So if you're applying for a job, for example, be modest. You can perhaps be open about some of your failings. You don't have to, and you don't want to pretend to be someone you're not, because I don't think that's going to work. And if you're in a job, then just be yourself. People can see you. People know what you can do. You don't have to really tell them. And they'll appreciate your general just reliability and your unobtrusiveness, and that's possibly the way to go about things. Yeah, let your own abilities speak for themselves. They don't have to be bolstered. Boasting and bragging is not going to help. It's just going to make things a lot worse. Having said that, there is going to come a point where you start to realize that something needs to change. Now, it's because of that top line moving. And with the top line moving, it may well be that in terms of the way you're handling things, you may realize that you're not getting it right. That you've had a misapprehension, or you've misunderstood something, or however hard you try to be modest, your ego is still there. You still have this idea of how exceptional you are, and that may not be helping. And that might actually relate to a situation where you're looking for a job, and if you've had difficulty looking for a job, I mean, it depends on your situation. I mean, I know people watching this video come from all sorts, of all sorts of situations as far as work and career. It may not be of any interest to them. But if you happen to be looking for a job, there may be something you're not getting entirely right. And you perhaps have a failing that you have not fully confronted. And now might be the time to confront it and to sort the issue out. On the other hand, the failing may not be about you, it may be about someone else. And if you're in a job, it may become clear that certain people are not behaving correctly and that change is required, and maybe the instrument of change is you. And when we move to the second hexagram, because we've got two moving lines, we start to get the feel that the situation at work, or your attempts to find a job, or your attempts to create a business or to run a successful business, something is not quite right. Because 18 is illness, working on what has been spoilt. You've got something wrong, or someone has got something wrong. It may not be your fault. So if you're working for someone, it may be that what you're working on and what you've been told to do is just incorrect, and something needs to be changed. Now, in extreme cases, this might be a situation where you're working in the wrong job. You may suddenly realize that the job you're in, you thought it was okay, but you now realize that it's very spoilt, and either you change your attitude to this job, or maybe you move on to something else. And if you're running a business, it's all's well, supposedly, but not quite well. And there is some aspect of your business that is rotting. I'm not saying anything is in real danger, but something is a bit stagnant. And if you don't address it now, it's going to get worse. But on the plus side, this week you can address it and remove the rot and get things back on an even keel. So I think that is quite optimistic, really, because yes, there's a problem, but it's a problem that can be fixed. Finally, there is relationships of all kinds, regardless. It could be romantic, could be business, could be friendship. It's just important with this hexagram 15 modesty to be, for us to, you don't have to show off. The people around you will just accept you as you are. So when you meet someone, whether you've known them for decades or whether you're meeting them for the first time, don't try too hard to pretend to be someone you're not. Don't worry too much about first impressions and getting everything right, looking right, dressing right, all that kind of stuff. It's not necessary. And if you were to try too hard, I think it would set things off on the wrong track. So regardless of what the relationship is, take the view that you are what you are, and make sure you give the other person plenty of space, because it's all about modesty. It's about keeping your ego in check and giving the other person space. It's not all about you, it's about them as well. It's about listening as well as talking. And that looks pretty good. But there may come a point where you start to recognize that something is not right in terms of relationships, and this is perhaps particularly if it's a longer term relationship. And I know one is always supposed to, in relationships, there are always two sides to the argument, aren't there? And someone tells you their relationship problems, and you always sympathize with them, but you don't know what the other person is thinking. And if there have been issues in any relationship you're in, do consider the possibility that it might be your fault, because that top line can be being at war with yourself, depending on your interpretation. So do consider how you might have been responsible for undermining a relationship you're in that is important to you. So make sure that your own behavior and your own ego are all in order, that you have kept your ego in check. Still, there is an alternative interpretation which is saying that with that top line, that really something needs to be changed. So in whatever relationship you're in, it's not perfect. And something needs to be sorted out. The sooner the better. And again, that is particularly if it's a longer term relationship. Maybe if it's a short term relationship, it's not such a big deal. I mean, people come and go in your life. And modesty transitions to illness. It's a constructive hexagram, illness, in terms of relationships. It's something you can do to make relationships better. Perhaps there's a relationship that has got off to the wrong start. Even if it's a new relationship, it's just got off to the wrong start. And may not be your fault, maybe the other person's fault, but you really maybe shouldn't be thinking in terms of blame. It's easy to blame, isn't it? It should be about what do you do to deal with this wrong start. Because if you don't deal with it, this issue is going to get worse. And so there you have to really confront it. Is it your fault? Is it the other person's fault? Is it something about the conditions in which the relationship is taking place? But whatever it is, this hexagram illness does suggest that you can do something about it. And that's the I Ching, and that's my view on this week. I hope you found it of some use. If you enjoyed this video, I would of course be grateful if you were to indicate that you liked it. If you are not subscribed, I'd be really grateful if you were to subscribe. And if you want to buy me a coffee, there is a link in the description. Thanks again for listening, and I will talk to you again very soon.